So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this session of the World Bank Fragility Forum focused on urban violence and the leadership of mayors and city leaders to address urban violence. We're very pleased that you all have joined us here today in the live version of this session, and very pleased to have most of our original panel that we had put together when we all thought that we would be together in person back in March. My name is Rachel Locke. I'm the Director of Impact Peace at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego, and a co-facilitator of the Peace in Our Cities initiative, which I will speak to in one moment. This session was originally planned to bring greater attention to the scope and scale of violence that takes place in cities all over the world on a regular basis, which is the vast majority of lethal violence and serious violence taking place in the world is in our cities. And as our world increasingly becomes urban with demographic trends, this is likely to increase if we don't do the necessary of taking all of the wealth of tools and knowledge and practical experience in addressing and reducing violence in cities and applying it to the problem set. So we have a massive problem, and yet we have a massive bank of knowledge and practical experience in how to address that problem. That was the original intent of this session when planned to be back in early March at the live version of the Fragility Forum. It is still the intention of this session, but of course now we can't talk about our cities without talking about COVID-19. The pandemic has brought into pretty significant relief disparities around our world, within our countries, and within our cities. It has also brought into stark relief just how crucial city leadership and local leadership is in addressing the pandemic from a range of perspectives, including communication, but also investments, the right policy, the right structures of coordination, et cetera. So we'll be asking our original questions, and we'll be asking a little bit how COVID has changed life on the ground and changed prospects for peace and prospects for violence. As I mentioned, this session was organized by myself at Impact Peace with our partners in Peace in Our Cities, which is an initiative that was launched a year ago to do exactly what I mentioned, to bring greater attention to the scale of violence in our cities. Over 500,000 people killed each year in instances of interpersonal violence in cities, and to bring greater attention to the scale of solutions and tools that we have, both to save lives and to build peace, and to create healthier, more resilient, safer communities. Peace in Our Cities is co-facilitated by our partners at the Plus Peace Coalition and the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies at NYU. We had originally planned to have joining us 2 additional mayors from the city of Escobar in Mexico and the city of Bangui in Central African Republic. They were not able to join this live session. However, they have recorded videos of themselves, which will be available on Thursday when this session is rebroadcast by the bank. We just one matter of business, which is that on the Fragility Forum YouTube link, there is a chat box. I do anticipate we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and comments towards the end of the session. Please put those questions into the chat box if you're interested. And a final note of just saying thank you to the World Bank for adapting a huge amount of interaction, engagement, and all of the spirit and energy that typically goes into the Fragility Forum when it is held live in Washington. That has been translated to these online forum. And so we're very, very grateful to the bank for hosting this event and for bringing the voices of local leadership and local civil society to the fore in such a strong way. I'm very excited to be joined by 4 speakers live. In addition to the 2 videos, we have Mayor Escobar from the city of Palmira in Colombia. Mayor Escobar was elected relatively recently, just under a year ago, in October of 2019. So he's really had to come into the office and faced some pretty significant challenges pretty quickly into his tenure, and has done so with great energy. And we have been very lucky to have him as part of the Peace in Our Cities initiative. He previously served in the mayor's office in Cali and so has significant experience with city leadership. We also have Mayor Whaley from the city of Dayton, Ohio, here in the US, closer to the East Coast than where I am on the West Coast. Mayor Whaley was elected in 2013 originally, and then re-elected, and I understand re-elected unopposed, which is a first in city government, if I understand it. So congratulations on that. She has been mayor, like I said, since 2013 and has been focusing on the areas of community development, manufacturing, and women and children's issues. Very lucky and grateful also, Mayor Whaley, to have you joining this conversation. Thank you. We will then have Beatrice Nzovu from the Life and Peace Institute joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. So we're hopping a little bit around the world today. Beatrice has over 15 years of experience as a peace practitioner, working across different areas of climate, as well as ideological, political, and resource-based conflicts. And she's got quite a bit of experience across sub-Saharan Africa, in addition to her work in Kenya. And I should say both Dayton and Nairobi are also city members of Peace in Our Cities. So all of our participants are within Peace in Our Cities. We then have as our final speaker, Bernard Harborn from the World Bank, who's the lead technical specialist in peace, conflict, and violence, has been with the bank since 2004 and is joining us from the hot, muggy den of Washington, D.C., which I hear is almost unbearable these days from a weather perspective. So thanks all for joining us. I'm going to launch right into the conversation, Mayor Escobar, with you, and ask you first to take about 30 to 60 seconds. Tell us a little bit about Palmira for those who aren't familiar with us. And then let us know how the spread of COVID-19 has impacted your city's commitment to violence reduction, and how the sort of localization of the pandemic, as well as the response to it, has changed or influenced how you think about peace and prospects for peace in your city. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rachel and the World Bank, for the invitation, all my fellow mayors around the world and members of the Peace in Our Cities campaign. As you said, I'm recently elected a mayor, and violence reduction actually is one of the main promises of our campaign. Is one of the main concerns of the average Palmyran citizen is how violent is this is to get killed for stealing my stuff while I'm going to work. So this is a very important issue for us. Palmira is the 20th largest city in Colombia. We have 354,000 inhabitants. We are also only 20 minutes away from the 3rd largest city in the country, which is Cali. We have in our territory the international airport and a lot of enterprises, so we have a good economic environment, even though now it's very affected because of the pandemic. As you said, we understand, of course, violence, urban violence as a complex and multicultural phenomenon. So, of course, we think this pandemic will we fear it will generate more violence in the near future. Because of these lockdown policies are having real impact in terms of employment, income generation, and of course this affect disproportionately the youth and marginalized young in the neighborhoods. Palmira's homicide rate has been going down for several years, but when you look at it, 54% of homicide victims are young people in between 16 and 30 years old. So that is what worries us. The rate has been coming down. Like our worst year was 2011, where we had 98 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Last year, we closed that indicator around 36 to 40. It depends on how you look at the population, because we had a recent census in the country. But like talking about this year with the pandemic, or like the first 3 months of the year without the pandemic lockdown, we were having a 29% reduction in homicide. During the lockdown, we have had even more reduction in homicide, of course, because we're asking people to stay at home. This homicide rate has gone down around 60% during those other 3 months, April, May, June. And we actually closed the first semester of 2020 as the most peaceful semester since 2005. But of course, we are fearing that this dynamic will change as the economic crisis comes before the pandemic. Also, the other thing you asked was the localization and how peace looks in our cities. I think this is very interesting because maybe the main contagion conglomerate where COVID is right now actually fits very well with more marginalized neighborhoods. So the spread of the virus is a lot quicker in some areas of the city where violence historically has been. And also, I think the peace concept has also changed, because now we have, during the weekends, people call the police the most, not to say I'm getting mugged or somebody is getting killed, but to denounce that somebody is having a party, because we are supposed to be in a lockdown. So now, like, the police number rings all day and all night denouncing parties. And that's kind of crazy, because now we have the police closing parties. So that's kind of what my answer will be.
That's interesting about the police being called. And I'm curious, actually, whether that's had, and maybe it's too soon to notice, but whether in those neighborhoods that have traditionally been, as you said, the most violent, whether that's had any influence on the relationship between the police and individuals living in those communities, either in a positive or a negative way, which of course is important from a sort of legitimacy and peace prospects perspective.
Well, actually, it's pretty harsh, because there's also like cultural issues here. So it's very hard for people. I think when we have a lockdown of 4 months and we don't know where it's gonna end, it's like so hard that people prefer to deny it. So now around the world, there's a lot of people with these crazy stories about COVID being fake, or COVID being 5G antennas, a lot of stuff. So it's like people rather deny this reality. And so when the police comes to end a party, actually that has created problems of violence from communities to police, because they don't understand why. They don't party, and that's a big issue. Actually, I don't know how you would call that, but it's a thing where people do not want to accept these new rules that we are upon.
That's fascinating. I wonder if there's been any, so we've heard these conspiracy theories and how they have spread so quickly and so globally, right, around the world, and different versions of COVID not being real and there being a conspiracy behind it. Has there been benefit to being connected to city leadership and otherwise around the world in either countering those conspiracy theories, or in thinking about how broadly to reduce violence or enhance peace in your city?
Yeah, I think this network is really useful for us because we are in a context of a lot of uncertainty, right? So we really don't know how to come. There's no textbook about how to deal with pandemics or how to deal with violence generated by pandemics or like big shocks. I was actually reading Naomi Klein because she has written a lot about the shock therapy and all that kind of thing. So I'm kind of reading those type of books to try to know what we're actually confronting here. We have our strategy of violence prevention, which comes with interruption, intervention, prevention, and safe environments. And I think this pandemic has also made that this strategy is more important now because we don't know what we can face after COVID. And so it's really important in an uncertain environment to be able to talk to other majors and around the world and say, hey, how are you approaching this? Because it's going crazy. So we need to know and compare what other cities are doing, and that is really helpful.
It's like co-learning in real time with the emerging dynamics that we're seeing. Just given that, precisely what you just said, and there's been stay-at-home orders, as the pandemic shifts, and as there's maybe an opening up, and I'm not quite sure where Palmira is exactly in the reopening. How do you see the potential for the pandemic shifting sort of your long-term thinking about public health and long-term thinking about violence reduction strategies, if at all?
Well, actually, it's quite interesting because Colombia, like South America in general, I will say, we had to see when the virus was only coming into our countries, it was the exact same time was when Europe was having the worst crisis. So since we saw that on live TV, we actually came with lockdowns very soon, very, very soon, like 10 cases and we locked down. And that maybe, I don't know, was a mistake because lockdown policies are not sustainable. So we had to start reopening when we hadn't had the first peak of the pandemic. So that's so we started reopening in June, but right now, actually, we're having the worst numbers we had since March. So we're having to start to close down again. So that's really hard for people to understand why we locked down so many times and we were reopening. Why are we closing again? It's really harsh. We were actually just doing that yesterday with socializing these measures and why we need to do it. But as I said, we find that actually public health and violence reduction strategies are very related because they require to work with communities in order to get those problems fixed. We require, as a public health strategy, to talk to people, to make them understand this is really important to take care of ourselves, to use bioprotection gadgets and all that. And of course, violence reduction also happens like that. It's not, we don't believe it's with police that this problem is structurally resolved. We believe we need to interrupt in communities that violence, dissuade the violence actions that happens in between the people of one neighborhood and the other because they have historical issues. We need to make an intervention in those communities specifically and prevent and make safe environments and also provide access to justice. So our strategy is very well aligned with what we think is a public safety approach and a public health approach. And we just got approved from our development plan from the city council. Our strategy was approved as part of our development plan, and now we are in the moment where we are going to start to implement and actually see if this works in the clusters that we have defined in the city, because violence is not equally distributed. It's in especially some parts of the city. So we're going to start with our strategy now, and we're planning to invest $1.5 million in the next 4 years in only the 22 neighborhoods that have the 50% of the homicide violence. And that is only like 10% of all neighborhoods in the city. So this is very well geolocalized.
Yeah, important point about how violence tends to concentrate in particular areas among particular people. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit more of a view into Palmira and to what you're doing. Mayor Whaley, I want to turn to you because I think there might be some interesting overlaps between what Mayor Escobar was saying and what your experience may have been with COVID-19 and the pandemic, but also some of these themes that were just mentioned in terms of public health approaches and public safety, as well as how violence concentrates. So to kick us off, can you give us just, again, a brief visualization of the city of Dayton, Ohio, and then talk a little bit about how COVID-19, again, has influenced or impacted your commitments to violence reduction and peace in your city?
Well, thank you, Rachel, and it's great to be here and on with you all this morning on impacting peace in our cities, and particularly talking about issues around urban violence. For us in Dayton, Dayton is a city in the middle of the country in the state of Ohio. We are a smaller community, around 140,000 people, and a community that is very diverse. And what we have seen, particularly during COVID, like many cities across our state and country, is actually a pretty dramatic increase in gun violence during this time. It is concerning to us. We think there has a lot of violence in general is actually increasing during the time of COVID, just because the social safety net in America isn't very strong. And so a lot of the techniques and tools people have to deal with challenges quickly turn to violence in our community. We have been sharing this with other mayors across the country, and it's something that we continue to worry about. We've had in the past gun violence we've seen rising. I think mostly in America due to just the access to lots and lots of weapons and guns. But this latest increase during the time of COVID is incredibly troubling to mayors across America.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember being in conversations back in March thinking that the opposite would happen, anticipating there would be an increase in violence in the homes, but a decrease in violence outside of the home and on the community. And in the US, that has not borne out. There has been an increase in violence in the home and violence in the community. How has, reflecting on what Mayor Escobar was saying about the localization of both violence and the pandemic, because we've seen here as well that the pandemic has hit certain communities harder than others. How has that localization of the pandemic sort of maybe influenced or changed how you think about prospects for peace in Dayton, if at all?
Well, I think what the pandemic is doing is it's exposing great inequities in our culture and in our communities. And that is a painful process for the community to go through, but a necessary one, and one that really, I think, will bring some pretty significant change. As you see across America with social unrest after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, hundreds of cities, including Dayton, had mostly peaceful protests around wanting change around violence to the African American community with police. And I think honestly those protests would not have happened without the pandemic. And I think the pandemic is making us think and really question, both as individuals and as leaders, what is the safety net in our communities? What are we doing when it comes to equity? And I'm hopeful that through something as tough as a pandemic, that we'll see some real systemic change in our communities, and that has to do with violence in the home, like you mentioned, with how we've seen this uptick, particularly around domestic violence and children, but also I think a lot of the gun violence that is happening is from teenagers, people under the age of 18 that don't have the skills to really de-escalate situations that are, nothing more than very small, as we call them here, beefs. And so I think, what the pandemic is doing is it's shining light to all communities about how we have to really change structures, change our societal norms and systems, and not leave people behind, because what happens in that wake is very painful for the whole community at large.
So in addition to being the mayor of Dayton, you're also very involved and in a leadership role, I understand, with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I wonder if I could ask you to just take a moment to describe some specific actions that mayors may be taking to try to address some of what you just described as to incentivize and energize maybe others to think about really that there can be real meaningful changes in some of the inequities that you've talked about.
Right. Under the leadership of our president, Mayor Greg Fisher, out of Louisville, he has put forward this effort he's calling the American Breakthrough. And really, the point is that there has to be pretty much structural, systemic changes overall to how we're providing service, but also what services are offered in our communities. And if you think about what's been happening in America for the past 40 years, we have really completely frayed the safety net of America. I think for the benefit of inequities that we haven't seen the likes of since 100 years ago in the early 1910s and 20s during the robber baron era of our country. And those effects we are feeling on the ground as mayors in our community. And so Mayor Fisher is looking at, and his teams are looking at, how we really break down the issues of poverty. What do we do as our communities are ravaged by gun violence and senseless killings in areas? How do we really broker the trust of community policing between our police forces and our diverse communities? How do we protect those that are new to our communities to make sure that they have full rights to participate in our cities, which makes them more full? These are the very difficult questions that mayors across the country are putting forward. I think in America, mayors and cities are the vanguard of what is next and the incubators of new ideas. And we're seeing that in action with the U.S. Conference of Mayors during this pandemic, which I think, again, is a painful time, but a time of change and excitement for those of us that are seeking change in our communities and our country.
So I'm going to have an opportunity to sort of bring this to this part of the discussion to a wrap on a hopeful note. So it sounds as though, even though it is a very painful time, you see hope. How do you see us, or what do you see are the necessary actions to really take advantage of the attention that's being highlighted right now on, again, the inequities, both at the leadership level and with communities? So where do you see hope, and how do we really sustain that hope over time to lead to real change?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the conversations that are being had right now in Washington, D.C. I think they're the beginning of seeds around how we're really funding our systems. What do our children really need to succeed in this new economy? And it doesn't seem, in the past, it seemed to be a little more at the edges, and now it seems to be going right directly to these inequities. I also say on the ground too, Dayton is a city that is around 40% African American and 50% white. And what has been really telling during the summer is the African American community has known innately and felt that there has been systemic racism, that the systems in place in America have been put in place so they do not reach their full potential. What is interesting is white America and white Daytonians are realizing that this exists. And so one community is having an awakening from a community that knows this very, very deeply and has personal experience in it. And so that is a huge opportunity for us. And we're experiencing as well on the ground a generational change in leadership that we really haven't seen in such a dramatic way, probably in 50 years. And so those kind of changes and opportunities and belief of new thought, I mean, give, I think, lift to mayors across the country about what can be and the opportunities of what we can look like, both coming out of the pandemic, but also what our communities can be like for this next generation that has had pretty wild change and upheaval, pretty constant because of how quickly our world and country are moving right now.
I have to say, I don't envy those who are teenagers and college students right now and trying to cope with all of the changes. It's quite an intense period of time. Well, I'm going to pause there on a moment of hope. I think it's really important for us to maintain and sustain and talk about hope, because that is what will take us forward and allow us to emerge from this period better. I want to switch over, Beatrice, to you, over to Nairobi, to ask you for a picture of what's happening where you are, in particular with regard to the impacts of COVID-19, the pandemic, how that has maybe shifted what has been understood to be Nairobi's commitment to violence reduction, and similar questions, sort of how the pandemic may have shifted or influenced what prospects for peace. And you're a peace practitioner, you've been working in this space for a long time. Do you see a shift in prospects for peace in Nairobi? Please, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks to the Peace in Our Cities initiative, as well as the World Bank for this opportunity to share. Just a little bit about Nairobi. Nairobi is a city, capital city in Kenya, in East Africa, and also considered a regional hub in many ways because of where it's located. It has a population of about 4.5 million people. And directly onto your question, I think COVID has practically halted the city's capabilities to address violence. Not so much its commitment to some of its violence reduction strategies, but because there have been some systemic challenges that the city has been faced with that then have been revealed during the pandemic. And so in some ways it has been seen to be ill-prepared. And so let me just exemplify this. Nairobi has had some leadership challenges. So right about when our first COVID case was announced, which was in March this year, the governor, who is sort of the mayor of Nairobi, or the counterpart in terms of Nairobi, was allegedly had some corruption cases against him. And so the national government then decided that some of the functions should be handed over to what they are now calling the Nairobi Metropolitan Service. And of course, it's led by somebody who came in from the military and who is now the one collecting revenue. And so in the midst of the pandemic, then it meant that the governor of Nairobi was unable to respond. And it also meant that immediately then it became difficult for the city to deal with the violence issues, because for peace and security issues, that still remains the responsibility of the national government. And sort of the city then has to play catch up in terms of finding its space. Another challenge has, of course, then been an increase in state violence, because when there was a lockdown introduced, as well as the curfew, Nairobi saw a number of extrajudicial killings. So as at June this year, there were 17 reported deaths and 95 complaints of police misconduct, and then 13 other deaths resulting from people complaining, oh, I had to, somebody jumped into a river because they were fleeing from the police because it was past curfew. And then there was also the death of a 13-year-old Yasin Moyo, who was shot on his balcony a few hours after curfew. He was playing on his balcony. And so all this was in an effort to ensure citizens adhered to the dusk to dawn curfew. But then some of the sentiments emerging from civil society were that, during the pandemic, the police have killed us more than the virus. And so this doesn't augur well in terms of creating public trust, particularly during this period. And then, of course, there have been unsafe public spaces because there was an increase in crime, particularly robbery with violence and thieving because of loss of jobs. So there was a lot of challenges with the economy. People were trying to survive. And so in this way, because people were unable to have sources of livelihoods, then crime increased. And but then also the other spike was creation of dangerous private spaces, because now homes were supposed to be presumably safe for everybody. But then, of course, the homes are not exactly safe, because there's been an increase in sexual and gender-based violence, with perpetrators being mainly close relatives, guardians, or, the persons living with the victims. And so then the city of Nairobi has been grappling with how to then deal with this emerging social problems, sexual and reproductive health problems, HIV, unplanned pregnancies that are emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic, while still dealing with trying to get enough beds in hospital and trying to respond to other health concerns. So indeed has been a challenge. We had at least in the country 3,000 teenage pregnancies being attributed to the closure of schools during the COVID pandemic. So then at the moment, then the city of Nairobi has established a gender-based violence task force to look into these issues. And of course, we haven't really seen outcomes. It's still quite new. It was established 2 months ago, but they're trying to include civil society voices and other voices to sort of help them now in this. Let me just speak very briefly about the role of security actors in all this. So there has been a shift, because rather than take care of security issues, the police have now been given a new task to ensure that everybody is adhering to these COVID-19 rules and regulations. And so the police have been more concerned with arresting citizens for not wearing masks, for being out during curfew hours. They've been busy manning roadblocks, but then of course also getting compromised because they're being bribed so that people can get out of the city when it was under lockdown. And so these are then new challenges. So when do they deal then with the issues of rising crime, when they're now becoming sort of like the COVID-19 response? But just to say that when then I look at this as a perspective of peace, so peace in Nairobi has now all of a sudden become about how do people put food on the table, and also how do they feel safe within their own neighborhoods and within their own homes. And so particularly in the informal settlements, and we have quite a number in the city, peace then has become, I don't want to sleep hungry and I don't want to feel fearful. But then of course, just to say that the city has been trying in collaboration with many other actors. So the city, as well as the national government in collaboration, have come up with creation of jobs for youth and street families in an effort to reduce crime by keeping them busy. They're giving them jobs to rehabilitate roads, to clear drainages, so that at least when they're kept busy, then the crime levels can be reduced. And of course, now in the last 1 month, there have been a few reduced cases. And then of course, they are keen to establish what they are calling a bread basket, which is then intended to identify the most vulnerable within the city, so that they can be able to receive some cash transfers to survive during the pandemic. And they're also planning to have a crime prevention task force set up, but that is still in discussion. But what I think has been really, for me, quite interesting has been then that in this gap, and as the city grapples with how to come in, there have been a lot of proactive initiatives by non-state actors, including civil society and youth leaders, who have then emerged to provide information, to provide temporary safe houses for sexual and gender-based victims, to spearhead hand-washing activities in their areas, to do murals, so some creative spaces, and so really to give people back their dignity within the pandemic. Thank you.
So thank you, Beatrice, for that. I think you gave us a very a comprehensive view of a lot of different points. I want to make sure we have time to get to Bernard, but I do want to just sort of pick up on these last points you were making and connecting them back to Mayor Whaley about sort of the prospects for change, and whether you are hopeful in seeing some of the work that you've just talked about, the initiatives that have been supported by community, by civil society, and whether you see hope in that in terms of perhaps long-term systemic shifts to inequalities, which of course are connected to levels of violence. Where do you see hope in Nairobi?
Yeah. So in terms of hope, I think one of the things is that there's been a shift on government reliability and people seeing it more as there's a need for collaboration in order to be able to get this right. And so some of the things I think that definitely need to continue would be the realization that the public health care system needs to actually involve the public. And there has been an increase in this realization. And if this happens beyond, then it means that there will be improved systems. And one of the other things then has also been regular and consistent communication by government, by civil society, by the city as well. And so this has meant that, you see slogans from the government, break the silence, at home and mean at risk, which then reassures the public, and they then carry these slogans along. And I think this kind of collaboration then means that if the same voice is being echoed, then it becomes more sustainable. I think other things have been people being asked to say, like violence reduction is not only the city government's responsibility, it is also your own personal responsibility. And people have become more proactive in working with security actors to report criminal activities or to really report things that shouldn't be happening. I was listening to, Mayor Escobar talking about reporting on parties, and that has also been happening a lot in Nairobi. And I think sort of then realizing that this is a responsibility for everybody may also then lead to systemic changes on more increased ownership. There have also then been spaces for dialogues between a mix of actors. And I think if these continue beyond the pandemic, then some of the challenges that the city is facing could be addressed. And there's been a lot of talk about, which hasn't happened previously, but about mental health and trauma awareness, which wasn't a conversation before. And I think for this to begin in Nairobi means that it may continue beyond the pandemic and shift perspectives on how people look at mental health, as well as how people look at rehabilitation and reintegration rather than imprisonment for petty crimes. And it has also created a lot of opportunities for alternative livelihoods that are being done jointly by governments and civil society. And so I think really a lot of opportunities have emerged in terms of, the pandemic is affecting us all, and therefore it's really important that we band together. So I really hope and pray that this continues way beyond the pandemic.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think you're kind of honing in on these points of mental health, which we hadn't picked up on so much previously, and is such an important point, and also the role of security actors and responsibilities at the city level versus the state level, the national government, so incredibly important. And I love that there's also a sense that hope is present and real change can emerge. Bernard, I'm going to put you a little bit on the hot spot now and ask you to reflect. We've heard a lot, I think, from three very different contexts, but some similar themes have emerged. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit about kind of how this aligns with or not kind of what the bank's thinking has been in terms of responding to the pandemic, and also investments in the space of violence reduction, and maybe how you see the emergence of conversations like this that emerge over geographic space, how that's beneficial or not to the discussion. So please, the floor is yours.
everyone can hear me well. This, as you say, a very interesting and timely set of discussions. And I think one thing that really strikes me is that, and looking for hope and silver linings in all this global mess, if you will, is the universality of many of the themes that have been discussed today and are out there in the discourse. And what's interesting for being a bureaucrat, dare I say, inside the World Bank, is that many of these themes are now becoming part and parcel. And whereas before, issues around patriarchy, around race and discrimination, around mental health were not necessarily taboo, but were not part of our daily discourse. And now they are. How that becomes actually structural and operationalized in terms of our financing and lending is the big question that outsiders here today need to keep asking and badgering big institutions like the bank. So although there are huge disparities, obviously still between North and South, what's interesting is these issues of fragility and competence. Who's a fragile leader and who's a competent leader are becoming very converged. And I think it was in one conversation that we had with Rachel Kleinfeld, where she was saying the whole question of what is fragility is obviously needs to be tossed out the door and rethought. Issues around inequality, violence, and on the flip side, police reform, basic income, safety nets. These are striking all of us wherever we sit and work. I think also what's interesting about the convergence of these themes is that because of resources, there are great institutes like the Kroc Institute, Chicago Crime Lab, JPAL, where practitioners like us can go to for the big question that mayors will ask, which is what works, what doesn't. And so I think that applicability of that research, the need for North and South practitioners and researchers to converge also around these themes is really important. In terms of what we're doing in this space, as many of you know, the bank has committed extraordinary sums over the next 2 years for the responding to the COVID-19 impacts, 150 billion over the next couple of years. The frontier, if you will, was focused on the public health response and the whole question of fiscal stability, given the massive drop in revenues and so on. The second tier is now really aimed at protecting the poor and the vulnerable, essentially through safety net programs and or community approaches. I think the big question for me, and which is where we need mayors and outsiders to keep banging on the door, is the question to which we look at front and center in terms of violence reduction itself. We have a new FCV strategy, a fragile and conflict and violence situations strategy, which came out in February. And now that's obviously going through in terms of what does it mean in terms of implementation and what are the linkages with COVID-19. I'll just bring up a few mentions of certain things that we're looking at, which may be of interest. So for example, we're working with the Igarape Institute in Brazil, looking at the whole question of social impact monitoring. And a whole variability of data coming back at us, which resonates with what both Mayor Gomez and Mayor Whaley were talking about in terms of clearly a uptick in femicide and domestic violence, but very weak correlation in terms of actual COVID mortality and homicide rates. And where we want to take that is then talking to mayors and saying, okay, what kind of data and information is useful to you real time in terms of how you can respond appropriately. Second is some work that we're doing in Haiti, which is very much in the framework of the social contract. And looking at, on one hand, the functionality and role of mayors and municipal governments, the degree to which they're trusted and seen as legitimate or not, which is obviously key, and then the degree to which citizens engage. And in some instances, there's a complete exit and dislocation, and in other cases there's real engagement. And that very much is dependent on the intermediaries very often. For example, armed gangs, very prevalent in urban areas, particularly Port-au-Prince, and the role of others, for example, religious leaders. We find the social contract is a very useful frame, particularly during this time, because of these more imperceptible issues around trust and legitimacy. And then third is the whole question of those who perpetrate violence and dealing with gang members. And we've worked with David Brotherton out of the University of New York on the whole question of rehabilitation of former offenders and the whole question of recidivism in El Salvador. That's in its very, very early days, but we see that as a way in which the bank can slowly begin to look at more directly the question of reducing violence, because it's a small piece in a huge amount of financing, and I think it's something that we should be doing more, and where this conversation is very timely. Back to you, Rachel.
So thank you. I also note that that's interesting in terms of connecting back to what Beatrice was talking about in terms of rehabilitation and potentially more and lowering recidivism and more restorative practices. Sorry, just had a little background noise for a moment. So thank you for giving that intervention. We're coming up on just 9 more minutes before we have to close, and I want to make sure that I give a moment, actually, Mayor Escobar, going back to you, because this question that I asked others sort of about how you see, it's such a crude way to put it, but how you see sort of taking advantage of this moment in order to systematically shift in some of the inequities in society. And so your point about how violence is concentrated in certain neighborhoods is part of the inequities, right? So do you see hope in this moment? Do you see the ability to really capitalize on how COVID is shining a spotlight? And what's the role of the mayor's office in sustaining that hope over the long term?
Well, I am a very optimistic person, so I would say I am biased for this answer. I think actually the pandemic has given us an opportunity to gather a lot of information about what's happening in the city that otherwise the people would have not given us that information. So especially like in Palmira, it's a big city, but it's not a capital city. It's not state capital, to say in order like that. So we usually do not have the same statistics that capital cities. And that's a problem, not having information to make decisions. So this pandemic has given us an opportunity to gather a lot of information, to actually see more closely, as you say, those income inequalities effects. It's not the same that when we say, okay, kids are not going to school. It's not the same a kid, if I had a son, I don't have a son yet, but if I had a son, it's not the same to say my son who has a computer, who has fast internet, to another kid in rural Palmira, 2 hours from here up in the mountain, where there is no even internet, and where the only thing we can give him is a bunch of copies that his teacher sends to the house in order for him to study by himself, or with parents that maybe have no education. So that gap actually is what worries us the most, and that's actually what we're thinking on opening schools, opening rural schools first. It's still crazy here to talk about opening schools. It's a very traumatic issue for parents to think to send their kids to school in the middle of a pandemic. But we are making the efforts in order to open some rural schools where the pandemic, where the virus is least, and where we know those inequalities are the most. So I think we're living a historic moment, and that's an opportunity to change some of the things that we have been doing, and it's also an opportunity for the country and for the city to see more directly those inequalities and to try to close them.
Thank you. Such an important point. Picks up on what Bernard was talking about in terms of data and knowing what your field of play is, so that you can take the steps and the actions that are needed in order to bring the right interventions to bear. In the 5 minutes that we have left, Mayor Whaley and then Beatrice, I'm going to come to you. Any closing thoughts that you may have in about a minute? And I'm also interested a little bit whether this point about data and whether there's been opportunity to make a fuller picture of what's happening in Dayton with regard to either violence or resilience and peace through data, whether that's been something you all have been discussing, and then any closing thoughts you may have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think data is the key place that you start the conversation, but it's really important that that data is not used in a vacuum, particularly around, as we look at, for example, police and community relations. We're talking about how that experience makes people feel a part of the community or not part of the community. And so I think that's what's really key, is this quantitative work mixing with the qualitative work to really get a real understanding of what the culture is of the community and that connection, particularly around violence issues. I think that's what's really important. So often we can get so much data that we can really lose the point of what we're trying to get to. Data is an important story piece, but it's really important that we tell the story of what peace can do, the opportunity peace can be in our community, and the tragedy of violence and what that can do to our community too. And those stories with data can make the biggest difference.
Absolutely, such an important point. Beatrice, same question over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the data for us has been important, and there've been a lot of researches ongoing at the moment. And I think for the city, perhaps some of it's being seen maybe to becoming, its responses are coming slow. But I want to look at it from a different perspective and say that they are gathering enough information and enough data to be able to respond in the right manner in circumstances that they haven't been faced with before. And so this becomes very important, that the data is accurate so that they're able to put the right responses in place rather than going in blind. And just to say that I hope that from all the data and all the research, it's eventually going to lead to learning. That we are not going to, the world is not going to operate as it did previously once a vaccine is found, but rather that this is going to be a moment of learning on how do we really address the emergent inequalities, the various challenges, but also the various potentials that have emerged during this time. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So it's interesting that you made this point. Peace in Our Cities as a network brought together our membership back in February in Amman, when many of us were still able to travel. And we had this conversation about data and research gaps and identified the cities. So your cities and others identified various needs for increased data collection, many of which you have all articulated. And then very quickly realized, Beatrice, as you were just saying, once March and April were upon us, that what's really needed is that data, but that data in the context of an exceptionally dynamic context that COVID has brought to us, and how things are changing so quickly. And going back to the point about how to deal with violence in a situation that we've never dealt with before, and just how crucial collaboration and having peer networks, whether it's Peace in Our Cities or the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Global Parliament of Mayors, all of these networks have been incredibly important to help people sort of think on the job, right? And use data and use different techniques and tools. We are at the end of our hour. This has been an incredibly enjoyable conversation from the perspective of seeing hope. Again, I think this is really important. It's also, I think, shed a lot of light on various different areas, including, of course, what we've ended on, the importance of data, the role and relationship of police and communities with violence, and with the overlapping veneer of COVID-19, just how important, and I hope we've brought stark relief to this leadership is, and where leadership is fragile, where there's a lack of legitimacy, a lack of trust, just how impairing that could be, and the important role of inequalities within societies, and both addressing acute violence that's happening today and the broader systemic inequalities that exist in societies. I want to thank hugely all of our panelists for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are. I have watched the sunrise where I am. I want to thank also the mayors from Bangui and from Escobar, whose videos will be available on Thursday on the rebroadcast. And finally, huge thanks to the World Bank for hosting this conversation and amplifying these voices. With that, good days to you all, and let's continue to forge ahead with hope. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Beatrice.